All right, I think it's a good time to start. Welcome to our panel. Our topic today is Evidence and Public Discourse, Academia's Role in Democracy. No smaller than that, but it's difficult enough as a topic. And I'm very, very lucky to be joined by an esteemed circle of panelists that I will introduce to you shortly. Maybe just a quick introduction. My name is Silke Mühlherr. I'm the co-CEO of the Alfred Landecker Foundation. Our mission is to strengthen democracy, remember the Holocaust, and combat group-based hatred with a special focus on anti-Semitism. And why have we thought that this topic would be a relevant one for today? It probably needs not much explaining, but we figured that in times when liberal democracies are under pressure, both from within and externally, it's imperative to know what you're up against, what past developments have shaped the situation we are in, and which scenarios might occur in the future that we need to prepare for. So we figured a clear case for evidence-based decision-making and a clear mission for scientists and academics, one might think. But what we see is something different. Scientists and their methods are under attack increasingly. Their findings questioned, their methods questioned. Yes, facts themselves are increasingly being disputed, replaced by opinions and gut feelings. And that makes the real wiggle room for us all a bit smaller, we think. And so the question is, how can science maintain or humbly regain its credibility, its relevance or effectiveness in democratic decision-making? And before I introduce the panelists, by a quick show of hands, who in this room belongs to the world of academia, science, researchers? Oh, okay, that's a clear majority. Is there anyone, politician, public ministries? 3. Media, journalism, communication. Welcome everyone. This is just to get a feeling of the room, how these groups intersect. So, allow me to introduce our speakers. Please welcome Sudha David-Wilp. She is Vice President of External Relations and Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund. Sudha leads the GMF's work in government relations, leadership development, and strategic convening. She's widely recognized as an expert on German-American relations and the transatlantic partnership that needs more explaining by the day, it seems. You can hear and listen to Sudha on many different media formats. Also with us today is Fabian Klose. He holds the chair of International History and Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Cologne. His research focuses on the history of decolonization, international humanitarian law, human rights, and humanitarianism in the 19th and 20th century. And he's also the director of the newly funded Cologne Center for Advanced Studies in International History and Law. Welcome. And so we've got a US perspective, a German perspective, and we're also joined by a UK perspective, which I think is very important in times when the European Union doesn't exactly know where they're going. And so it's a bit of an outsider view, but an informer insider view. So we're lucky to have you. Andrew Thompson, he's Professor of Global and Imperial History and a Professorial Fellow at Nuffield College in Oxford. He co-directs the Oxford Center for Global History and serves as Associate Head of the Humanities Division for Research. You've got an upcoming book, Andrew, Humanitarianism on Trial, and I think that's very timely, and I'm really looking forward to reading it. It will be published by Oxford University Press, and it examines how global systems of aid, development, and human rights took shape at the end of the empire, and certainly how these developments inform the world we live in today. And we're excited to announce that Fabian and Andrew are actually launching a new research project together with a focus on the history of global governance and human security in the long 90s, an era that in a way seems long gone, but has got implications until today. So we're really looking forward to this coming into effect. So without further ado, let's start with the panel. And just for everyone, we will open up this panel in about 20 minutes time, so get yourselves ready. If there are any questions you want to ask, you will have the opportunity to do so. We wanted to open this by exploring the question, what actually is the role of science in public and political decision making? Because, I mean, there might be a lot of people who would argue none. There is no role. Because, I mean, it's become a very fine line between activism and science. And so I would love to explore this question. Sudha, with you first. Why should science have a public voice in democracy at all? And where do you see its legitimate limits?
So, Silke, thank you so much for the invitation today. It's a pleasure to be here with the Falling Walls Summit, and thank you to the Landecker Foundation. Great to also speak with Andrew and Fabian. So I am not affiliated with a university like my co-panelists, but I do work for a think tank. And, you know, I think this is also a category of organizations that has fallen prey to the backlash, popular backlash, both in Europe and the United States. And the work that we do, whether it's transatlantic security, or prosperity, innovation, how can Europe and the United States work together to continue the economic growth that we've had over the last 8 decades, that all has to have democracy as an underlying sort of foundation for it. And I think a functioning democracy needs facts, needs science, because we as a think tank, we are experts, we write on these issues, but we also need to inform policymakers so that they, with their counterparts in Europe, can make decisions that help in furthering collective security, help in furthering growth in a time of tremendous changes. So I think this is why it's so important that experts, academics, are realized as a important segment for functioning democracies, or a resource for functioning democracies.
So that was answering the first part of my question. What about the second one? Where do you see its limits in consulting as a researcher, as an expert?
So I think what's happened is perhaps the information that we've given and the decisions that policymakers have taken has not necessarily shown that democracy is working. And this is why we find ourselves in this moment where established parties are struggling to become relevant or stay relevant. You see this in the US, but you also see it in Europe. I think Germany, too, is seeing a lot of political fragmentation. And I also work for a think tank that's nonpartisan, but it's very hard in today's age in the United States to be considered nonpartisan. You're always, seen as taking a side. And I think it's also incumbent upon these institutions to regain trust, to show that we're here for larger goals and not necessarily for a party or political persuasion.
Thank you very much. Fabian, the role of academia, science research in consulting politicians or informing the public debate. What are the opportunities and what are the limits?
Yeah, thank you very much for your introduction and for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here, and I just can join Sudha's perspective that I think in a time of crisis and pressure on liberal democracies, it's really important that we have academia playing a role in not only communicating, but also doing research. I think that the production and the dissemination of knowledge in an age of fake news, growing fake news, is fundamental for us, that we have this thorough research based for the dissemination and production of knowledge. And I would say it's not only that we are speaking, I mean, if you're talking to whom we are speaking, I think it's not only political decision makers we should speak, like on an elitist level. I mean, first of all, I'm speaking to my students, right? And they are also part of democracy, they are part of society. So I speak to my students in my lectures, I speak to the academic community in history. And then I think we should, as academics, we should move beyond the ivory tower. I mean, we should not remain in the ivory tower, but we should speak beyond the ivory tower and reach out to society, because this is how we can fulfill our role in society and defend liberal and democratic values. And this leads me to your second question, where are the limits? I think there is a very thin line between academia discourse and becoming activist. So I think there is always the risk, if you're leaving the idea of really talking about on the base of thorough research, there's a thin line that you just can become an activist and leaving this space. And I think there is also a danger and a limit to our role as academics.
Can you make this a bit more concrete for us? Sorry if I'm torturing you here, but in your field, history. Not letting you slip away that easily, maybe.
No, you're not torturing, but if you're coming from I mean, if I think about the German debate, for example, there's so often, I have the feeling that history is everywhere. Everyone is talking about history, but actually no one knows about history. And this is something where it gets problematic. I mean, you should do first research, you should get knowledge, you should produce and disseminate knowledge, but not just taking history as bits and pieces to instrumentalize history. And I think this is, if I think about the German debate, about the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. I mean, if you think about the public debate, this was very often the case that people were using history to making arguments and not really looking at the facts and historical research. So that I think there's the danger that people are becoming activists for things.
Thank you. Andrew, what is your perspective? Activism, introducing facts, and also responsibility of a researcher?
Look, I mean, I think, we are, as other two panelists have already said, and you've implied, we are living in a particular moment. I'm not convinced as a historian, the unprecedented word is always difficult for us.
It's all new, isn't it?
But we are living in a particular moment, even if it's not the first time we've lived in it. And what strikes me is that it means that universities, science, academia now have a dual role. And it's perhaps easier for us to go to the second thing that I'm going to mention in a minute than it is the first. But the first is that we are an integral part of the fabric of civil society. And if you accept that, that means as a corollary that we have a responsibility, if not an obligation, to practice ourselves and not just to preach liberal democratic values. Free speech is an easy thing to say. It's often a harder thing to live up to. And it's hard to live up to when it requires us to listen respectfully to views that we strongly disagree with and might even at times offend us. But in the academy, there's an obligation on us at this particular moment for all views to be heard. Silencing people through no platforming or shouting at each other rather than engaging in measured debate is not going to help our universities to perform that role. It's going to degrade it. So I think, the first thing to say is we need to look inwards on ourselves. Now then, as the question implies, I think we've got a huge amount to contribute looking outwards to society, to help society understand the true value of liberal democratic institutions to inclusive, flourishing, thriving societies, and to help societies understand what happens when they come under attack. How do we make them accountable? How do we defend them? How do we reform them in an age of extraordinary technological change, geopolitical upheaval, growing environmental pressures? So yes, we should be looking outwards, but actually to look inwards at this particular moment isn't an act of navel gazing. It's an acknowledgement that we have a responsibility, a locus and an agency to make sure that we are practicing the very values that we want to see wider civil society and government embrace.
You're mentioning a really important point, academic rigor, academic standards in listening to each other, fighting and controversies being not a negative thing as such, but maybe a means to get through the thick of things. But I mean, what we've seen in various crises, be it COVID, be it ongoing wars, that science has become instrumentalized or scientists have become activists. Because it feels like there's no shortage of opinions that are spread out there, but I guess for a wider public, it sometimes is really hard to acknowledge and know what is a majority opinion, what is a minority opinion. So, you know, if every voice is being heard, for non-experts, it's hard to judge. And certainly media has got a role, politicians have a role in this, but it feels also in the reliability of facts, it's also, it's hard to convey the legitimacy or the relevance of facts. Is that something that resonates with you, something that you have to deal with in your everyday work? Whoever wants to answer.
Yeah, maybe, you know, I think I have a problem with opinion. I can have an opinion of everything. I mean, I can have an opinion that the weather is nice now, but it's not for others.
You'd be pretty alone, I think. But
yeah, but
depending what you come from, Andrew, is this nice weather for you as a Brit?
Well, our benchmarks aren't high in the UK, so I'm perhaps not the person to answer that.
So I think it's not about opinions, and this is what I tell my students. I mean, you can have an opinion, we can talk about it, but if it's coming to research, I mean, there are standards as academics, and we should keep the standards. And also the standards are under attack, right? I mean, from various sides. So we should really defend these standards, like critical reading, critical thinking, critical writing, critical discussing, as Andrew said. I mean, this is science. This is the core of science that we are discussing. I'm a little bit, you know, I don't like the word opinion, because I can have an opinion of everything, and I'm always very cautious when someone in the seminar said, I have an opinion. Wow, yeah, okay, great, but where's your proof? I mean, have you read the sources? Have you developed an argument on the basis of your research on the sources? So this would be my short answer to the opinion question or the opinion comment.
Is, Andrew, in today's attention economy, you know, where everyone is enraged and unnerved easily, is these like scientific standards and the differentiation between a fact that you can prove and an opinion that you might develop in your gut, is that something that is communicated easily outside the ivory tower? I'm calling you ivory tower is probably also a frame that you know, has been instrumentalized in an anti-elitist movement. But is that something that you feel we can actually expect an audience to get onto?
Look, we just, you know, all lived through in recent memory a massive stress test of the science system. It was called the COVID-19 pandemic. In my own country, I used to be the head for 6 years of a government funding agency, and two of my former colleagues sort of nightly flanked on TV, either the Prime Minister or the Health Secretary. And, you know, I felt ambivalent about that. On the one hand, there's a real danger of science as objective, impartial fact being politicized. But on the other hand, would we have not wanted to see science at the center of those debates? So, you know, I think that, you know, in broad terms, did the scientists always get it right? In this country, the UK, the US in COVID, probably not. But did the system stand up pretty well to scrutiny? I think it did. And we certainly didn't think, you know, at the beginning of the COVID crisis that we were going to get through it nearly as quickly as we actually did. But I do think that academia has a responsibility to speak truth to power. Now, you need to speak to power in a way that you think power is more rather than less likely to listen. And I think you have to accept that power sometimes will not listen. But that should not stop you speaking the truth. The moment we stop speaking the truth, I don't quite know what we're here for as universities.
Speaking the truth to powerful people is probably something that, I don't know, lies at the heart of GMF's work. What are your experiences with that?
So, you know, I just want to kind of go back to what Andrew said. I think and COVID-19 is a good example, because I do believe, you know, scientists were trying to be arbiters of information in a time of unprecedented time, at least in our lifetimes. But universities, at least in the United States, and I know things happen in the United States kind of first and drifts over to Europe, have been caught up in the culture wars, and institutions, elite institutions in the United States, are seen as being predominant, or were being seen as predominantly center-left. And of course, who were the people that were hurt most during COVID-19? It was the small businesses, the working class people. So there seemed to be an element of not necessarily having connection what it was doing to people's everyday lives. And this, of course, helps populists in general because they push back against these universities that are seen as liberal bastions, that are seen to be actors helping civil society, helping the greater good. And there was a pendulum swing in the United States. Andrew also referenced about the whole, the notion of not allowing speakers to have free debate, not inviting certain people to certain universities because of what he or she stood for. And this, I think, was an issue, especially when you have millions and millions of taxpayer money intertwined with these institutions for basic research, which of course is the innovation backbone for the United States economy, but also leads to kind of an administrative state in the university system all across the United States. And people wonder, where are my taxpayer dollars going to?
I mean, you're touching on probably a crisis that lies at the heart of things. It's a crisis of trust in science, in institutions, and I sometimes wonder whether that is more a challenge of communication, how things are being perceived, or is it a contestation of power and access and resources, something that you were hinted at. Is that something that you, Andrew, Fabian, have opinions on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
or even facts that you can prove?
Facts. I think that if you all agree on the fact that academia is playing a crucial role for our democratic society, I think it's not the best idea to cut budgets for universities. This is happening right now in Germany, all over the place. So I think that we have to invest in academia and not cut budgets. So that's a perspective of a German university professor. And we can have this discussion about this. But I mean, going back to the question, I think that it's both ways. I think that we as academics, to be honest, we are not always the best communicator. Because if a journalist wants to get a quick information, we have a lot of sentences and we would like to have footnotes on it, and it's complicated. So I think we as academics have to get some training to bring complex topics or subjects to the broader public. But at the same time, I expect also journalists and political decision makers to listen to us. And this is what Andrew just said. I mean, it's both ways. I mean, we have to offer it. We have to reach out and get engaged without losing our scientific basis to the broader public. But then also political decision makers have to listen to us. And so it's both ways, I would say.
Supply, demand? So what do you say, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, my Oxford College that you mentioned, Nuffield College, is a graduate social science college. Please don't tell them I'm a historian, as I might not be able to go back into my... but we had our endowment in 1937 from one of the country's most generous philanthropists, Lord Nuffield. And in 1937, he wrote into our college's charter, I mean, boy, this was precedent, that you have a responsibility to build cooperation and dialogue between the academic and non-academic worlds. What an extraordinary thing to put in an educational charter. And we do.
At that time.
At that time. And that communication, and ever since then, decade by decade, we've tried to engage in high-level public policy debate, for a long time UK-focused, now trying to broaden out more internationally. So I accept all of that. But I think I would want to go on and say another thing. Now, I am fed up of us thinking that we need to apologize for ourselves as universities. We do not. And if politicians of whatever political background, from the left or the right, want to wage war on our institutions, want to attack them, want to undermine them, want to starve them of funding that they need to do the research that they're going to do, they should be careful what they wish for, because these institutions have been a long time in the making, but they'll be a lot quicker to damage, if not destroy, if we're not careful. And then getting back what you have now will take a long time. So I think there's a slight sense at the moment is I don't want to be on the back foot in these debates trying to apologise or be defensive. I want to get on the front foot of these debates and assert our value in liberal democratic societies and hold our politicians of whatever political stripe to account for supporting us and, to do the things that we need to do and making us accountable in the doing of them.
So how can scientists, researchers, think tankers remain credible and relevant in a time that is, framed by hypermorality and is very attention-driven? Because, what is the impact that you can actually promise and that you have to offer to make the pitch that you actually argued for?
So I think it is really difficult, and I agree with Andrew because, politicians are instrumentalizing the situation. I think there should be a reckoning, and I think that is happening in the United States about, what was the role of campuses, after October 7th, after, and before that, all the culture wars that were happening, and what did that do to the image of universities. But at the same time, you don't want governments dictating academic freedom is precious, right? This is what is important for all our societies. You want free thinking in order to flourish. So I think it's a matter of universities, and I see it in the United States right now with university presidents trying to find the line about, making sure that academic freedom is not trampled upon, but also needing the research from governments in order to do good work. And there's plenty of state universities that also receive money from the federal government that benefit farmers, or how do we do better on the factory floor? And this is helping people that are not necessarily the coastal elites. And I think it's not necessarily the academics that need to do that, but I think it is up to the university presidents or administrators to show how academia or how universities are helping the economic landscape, and also obviously the innovation economy that's both in Europe and the United States. That's what I would do, and we need policymakers to also be that bridge to explain to voters why it's important that this university has created so many jobs. I think that's you could probably talk about Oxford and Cambridge and the whole research triangle that's emerging there, and you have many instances of that in the United States, and of course in Munich with TUM. There are lots of spillover effects for academic institutions, and I think policymakers need to be equipped with that information.
But isn't that also a question of certain areas in academia? Just a question, because if you talk about economy and innovation, probably people are more inclined to see and recognize the impact research can have. But I feel like in the humanities and the social science, it might be a bit of a different story, but that is just an assumption. The proof of output legitimacy, the proof of impact, and the attacks seem to be a lot more ferocious than in the area you just described.
Well,
but I would like to hear whether
I'd like
agree.
These gentlemen should weigh in, but I would think that a university is a laboratory for open thinking, and I think you need both sides of the brain in a university to establish that kind of environment. So fine, the money you may have the business case studies from the STEM field, but I would think academics like to have an open environment. In a university, you need to be holistic in that approach.
Yeah, and as Andrew said, we will not apologize for coming from the humanities. And what is the impact? You can have it in science where then a company, a startup is coming out of this. But if I have my students, I would say 75-80% of my students are becoming teachers. Impact? Yes. If they have a good education at my university and they're going to schools and teach, what bigger impact do you expect for democratic society? Mm-hmm. So I think as coming from the humanities or being a historian, there's very often a very wrong picture that we as historians, we're just dealing with the past. Yeah, we're dealing with the past, but not because we like the past so much. because we want to draw lessons for the present and maybe also for the future. So, I mean, can you value these impacts in companies, startups? No, you can't. But this does not mean that the humanities don't have any values. I would argue that the value for democratic society is very much so in the humanities, and I would say I'm not apologizing for being a historian, I'm not apologizing for coming from the humanities. I would like to ask to be more self-confident about what we are doing and what is our impact for society, especially in times where you actually have to explain so many crises around the world. I mean, we are the experts and we can do this. I mean, not me, but all other colleagues they can do it. I mean, together we can do it.
Don't hold back. If this might be a perception issue and a communication issue, are traditional policy papers, academic reports still effective tools to influence public debate, or do we need new formats that actually cater for this new, information ecosystem that might have not the bandwidth to absorb all the differentiations that you are able to make, luckily? Andrew?
Well, look, I mean, I would sort of row back a little bit from that before thinking about sort of modes of engagement to good principles of engaging. My own college, for several years, we've run a project on the past, present and future of international organizations. That's now morphed into a Nuffield Humanitarian Forum, which two of our former development ministers, Valerie Amos and Andrew Mitchell, chair. And I think we have an obligation as researchers to really fully involve people and meaningfully involve policymakers and practitioners in the research process. So I think going to them at the end of the research and sort of then, shopping your results rather than involving them right at the get-go, is not the right way to do it. I think sort of going at the point when you think you have all the solutions rather than talking to policymakers about how you design your research, what the problems are, how you're
gearing them
work through the
towards the
challenges. And I think, if you get the principles right, that tends to lead you to the right modes of sort of engaging downstream. But I do want to come back to the fact that, I think our politicians, they're not all culpable of this, but some of them at the moment, and not just in the UK and other parts of the world, are cherry-picking off a list of disciplines to say that some are more important than others. That's not the way in which the international organisations that I've been engaging with over the last several years think. Have I ever had to persuade them of a value of a historical perspective or a knowledge of the past? No, I haven't. So, in many ways, the politicians who are attacking the humanities and social sciences are really out of tune with how wider society are thinking about these problems, and we need to stop putting boundaries between hard science, social science and humanities, because my experience usually on university campuses is those disciplines want to talk to each other and work together, and we need to stop having a political discourse that makes that more difficult than it should be.
You touched upon the topic of funding, and I might argue, you as the university representatives, it's probably to be expected that you argue we need more money, which is absolutely legitimate. But what would be a critical stance towards the whole funding question if public funding is dwindling? Also, probably due to economic circumstances we're in. What are, revenue streams, if you might call that, although that might be a framing that's a bit foreign to humanities and social sciences, but revenue streams that you think in the future are acceptable, and what are, funding options that you would be wary because it might endanger academic independence, neutrality? Are these questions that you think about that touch upon your everyday work? I don't know, Fabian?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we always have to be careful who is funding what. And I remember in my academic career spending time in the US, there were also, suddenly some people wanted to fund chairs there, and then you you looked who is the background and what is the background about, and it was a political dimension of funding a chair. And we also have this discussion at the University of Cologne that we have to look as a faculty, we have to look who is funding what and where's the money coming from. So there's absolute limit, because if we bring in people or funders who are then limiting our freedom of science, then it's not helping. It's actually damaging the university, the academic system. But at the same time, if federal funds are cut, we have to be flexible and have to look where funding is coming from. I mean, Alfred Landecker Foundation is a very good example, as we are closely working with the foundation now. That is great. That a great opportunity for us to fund our fellowship program at the CHL, getting funding for our synergy grants together with Andrew. I mean, we have to be flexible if we want to proceed, and if we want to have jobs created for the younger generation of academics, postdoc positions, PhD positions. I think we have to show them flexibility, but there are also limits if it's coming to see that a funder might be having a political agenda funding a chair.
Andrew, what is your view on this?
Well, I mean, I think we, whether it's the US, the UK, or Germany, we have to recognise that we're living at a moment where there are huge pressures on public finances, and I don't think universities have any greater entitlement to constrain budgets than our schools, our hospitals, our police, our armed forces. Add to that list what you like. But do I think it's important that countries invest in their science base, to imply the full range of disciplinary activity? Of course I do. I think my worry is not just the quantum of funding coming in. Of course, that is a worry at the moment, and we probably will be more reliant on the sort of private philanthropic foundations that Landecker represents in a period of constraint on public funding. But it's that whatever the overall size of, to use an English phrase, the sort of cake is of funding into our universities and for our research or science bases, that it doesn't get overly directed to some areas rather than others. The risk when funding gets constrained is that it gets more politicized, more instrumentalized, more pushed in some directions and then not in others. Yeah. So I think it's a double challenge actually. One is, for universities to be funded as well as they can be funded given the constraints on sort of public finance. But the other is to make sure that whatever funding is going to universities isn't is as evenly balanced and spread as it can be across the full range of activities that we engage in.
So I would love to know, is the notion that I'm getting, but I might be wrong, so disagree please, is the notion that state and public funding is per se more neutral than private funding, is that actually accurate?
No, because, and I will just back to the think tank world and the foundation world. I mean, we also fundraise among different actors, and we differentiate between restricted and unrestricted funding. Now, the best type of funding is unrestricted, where we as an organization decide how to allocate our resources because the funder believes in the overall mission, and we're very careful about where the money comes from. But then there's, of course, restricted funding, and this is where it takes, courage and also foresight about what is good for the future growth of your organization, university, think tank, what it may be, about where you're going to invest in themes, topics in your future. So it's also about choice on the part of the university or the think tank or a different actor. But I will say, and both Fabian and Andrew have talked about this, governments are stepping back, and not just in the United States. I mean, we all saw the calamitous decision about USAID and what that's done to the landscape, and philanthropy is not going to be able to fully compensate for that decision. But I think this is the thing, there is always a notion on the part of populists about there is some truth. Maybe USAID was ripe for reform, and there are other probably organizations that are, you have the debate in Germany about the building bike paths in South America. So there is a point about, having reform, but unfortunately, these decisions are not thoughtful, and it's more nihilistic in terms of just breaking everything and dismantling everything, and rather than thinking about what's necessary moving forward. So yes, private, it doesn't matter. It's very hard to get neutral funding. That, I think, is the gold standard for any organization that allows you as an organization to think about what our mission is and what our goals are in the near and long term.
Andrew, Fabian, I would love to ask you and weigh in on that question. Just to get the audience ready, after that I would love to open it, so get yourselves ready. Andrew, Fabian, do you have opinions on public money being more neutral than private funding?
Just give me some time to think.
It was not, I think, a distinction that I would draw. I was, as I've said previously, 6 years in UK research and innovation, as well as leading a funding council. I led the international strategy. I think some of our programming might sometimes have fallen sort of prey of the charge of being sort of overly targeted and directed, but we ran many schemes, and very proudly, which were basic sort of fundamental curiosity-driven science, and some of the targeted schemes were very popular with researchers as well. And I think private foundations do that, sometimes do it well, and sometimes do it less well too. So I don't think that a funding source, when you get to a single individual giving, then obviously you're likely to have an agenda of some sort that might align with the university and might not align. But to me, I think it would be less a question of sort of what the funding source is, and whether funders are working as hard as they can to think about what the needs of university and the science system are. And that will sometimes mean some programs that are more targeted, because you're trying to build up an area with good reason, and sometimes leaving funding sort of less constrained. And these are balancing acts that you have to engage in. Yeah.
I think this is a question you cannot answer in general. I was lucky enough that with private funding, I always was working with foundations who made from the starting point clear that they will not interfere in my freedom of research, and want to direct my research in any role. So I think it depends on who is funding and who is the partner you're working with.
As promised, any hands? We have a microphone somewhere, maybe there in the back row. And why don't we gather 2 or 3 questions, and let me emphasize questions. Have a question mark at the end and not an exclamation mark. That would be much appreciated. Could you stand up? That would be better for the camera, if possible.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, try to be brief. Thank you all very much. I would like to go back to the beginning of the discussion when you mentioned you have a problem with opinions. I very much agree. And I think it's a small balance, and I would love to hear more about that, between what Andrew said about being a platform. Academia needs to be a platform for different perspectives. Now, where do you draw the line? Like, perspectives, opinions is often used as a synonym, and I'm very worried about the Trumpism, pandemic, etc. wave of opinions being conflated with what we know as historical truth, or at least build an argument with context. So it seems as a contradiction. I don't think you meant it that way in the panel, but I would love to expand that discussion a bit more.
Can we gather? There was one more here in the front. And then we also go over to that side, if that's possible. Wary of the time. Yeah, here in the front. Thank you.
Just briefly, because I follow up on your question, I would also like to challenge the attitude that it's not about opinion, because I'm working in science communication. It seems to be about perceptions and identities, these discussions. And perceptions seem to have it seem to be immune against facts. So how can we change the perceptions of the society in order to move forward? And because the other day I read on a T-shirt a statement which brings it to boils it down. It says, "I know you're right, but I like my opinion better." So we could of course say academia has nothing to do with that. We deliver the facts, and society has to deal with them. But in my view, we also have a responsibility to try to change the perceptions.
And one over here.
Yeah. Sorry, just to follow up on the question there as well. I'm not entirely convinced that seeking out debates with often quite nefarious views is necessarily best serving liberal democracy. I think if we take anything from climate change to immigration and so forth, what often seems to happen is there's a deliberate strategy to flood the public discourse with pretty poorly substantiated opinions which keep dragging us back to first principles. So I'm wondering, the question I suppose is, do we as academics simply need to get better at challenging those views, or do we actually serve democracy better by editorializing out some of that stuff and choosing not to have some debates?
These are three hard questions, and the fact that we have 5 minutes remaining, get at it. So, yeah, Andrew?
I mean, instinctively, the last question is a real question, and I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to it. Instinctively, I'm against editing out, because I just see in Oxford at the moment, particularly in terms of geopolitical upheaval that we're living through and the debates that that's provoking, the editing out often comes back to bite. So I'd prefer to have the debate, actually. I think there is, without getting too philosophical, there is perhaps a distinction to be made between fact and interpretation. But whilst remembering that facts can be contested and some interpretations might be more valid than others. So, knowledge is an inherently contested thing, and it should be a contested thing. That's part of democratic debate. My problem isn't with knowledge being contested. My problem is with some of the ways in which it is being contested, in the times that we live at the moment.
Sudha, Fabian?
Yeah, I mean, I think censorship is a slippery slope. And again, I refer back to my own country, and I think the pendulum swing is happening, unfortunately, because there has been a time in the university circle in the US where there was, cancel culture, you can't deny it. And certain academics were not allowed to speak. My daughter goes to a university that is very much about academic freedom. She's at the University of Chicago. And I think if more schools would kind of adopt this framework, the Chicago principles could help sort of the debate flow better in universities, because frankly, and I have her friends that have gone to other elite institutions in the United States, and it has not been a great atmosphere for open debate over the last couple of years. And I think you have to be very careful. But I agree with you. Like, we also don't want to have performance artists spewing things that are not based in fact. And I do think universities, there is some gatekeeping that's necessary. But let's think about the gatekeeping where it doesn't turn back to the beginning of our debate. Where's the line between activism and knowledgeable debate?
Yeah, I would say that, as I said, I have nothing against opinion. Everyone can have an opinion about everything. But if it's coming to a discussion based on arguments, I would like to see what is the basis for this argument. And we as academics are trained to do sincere, thorough research to create an argument. And even academics, we all know this, we have different perspective and interpretation. You can read a source in this way and you can read it in a different way. And then you have an academic, and I think it's also the style and the mode you discuss. But what I don't like is that in public discourses, there's very often the fact that there's an opinion, and then it's suddenly because I know it from history. And then, no, that's not the way. I mean, you have to, if you have an argument, then please show me the argument. What is the basis for your argument? How did you research about it? And this is what, as academics, we are trained to do. And we should bring this quality into the public discourse, right?
But isn't the decisive problem, though, that everyone seems to be looking for an arbiter of what argument is the most valid one, and that leaves the public or even political decision makers puzzled, because who judges the validity of different arguments?
Yeah, maybe. But again, you ask us about the role of academics.
Yeah.
And as an academic coming from the humanities, I can just say that, and therefore I think it's really highly important to keep standards in education and at the university. To defend these standards, critical reading, critical thinking, critical writing, critical discussing, up and defend these standards. And as a historian or an academic, I can just say that this is how I'm trained and I'm thinking, and this is something I want to bring into the public discourse. And this is not about opinion, actually.
Thank you very much. I think we have done a precise landing on 50 minutes. Thank you everyone for listening, for engaging, to the panelists for sharing your perspectives and well-funded facts and opinions. And thank you for the Falling Walls Foundation to have us. Thank you very much.